It was a Saturday morning when the knock on my front door came, loud and heavy like someone wanted the whole street to hear it. And the second I opened my eyes, I knew something was off, because we never got visitors that early, and the sound had a strange rhythm to it. Not the polite kind of knock you expect from a neighbor, but sharp, commanding bangs that felt rehearsed. And when I peeked through the side window, I froze because standing on my porch were two men in dark uniforms, sunglasses covering half their faces, even though the sun was barely out. And they had shiny badges clipped to their belts that somehow didn't look right. Too new, too cheap, like the kind you see in costume shops rather than in a real police station, and my gut told me straight away that something was wrong, that these so-called officers weren't who they wanted me to believe they were, because something about their posture, their stiff movements, even the way they looked at each other, it screamed fake, and I whispered under my breath, "Something is off about those badges." I should probably explain how it all got to this point, because until a few months ago my life was quiet, maybe even boring by some standards, and that was exactly how my wife and I liked it. A calm suburban neighborhood with tidy lawns, weekend barbecues, the kind of place where you wave to the mailman and kids ride their bikes without worry. But then the Homeowners Association decided to remind us that peace doesn't last long when power-hungry people get a taste of control. The HOA in my neighborhood wasn't just strict, it was suffocating. Run by a handful of board members who took pride in enforcing the tiniest of rules, like measuring grass with a ruler or demanding you repaint your fence if the shade looked a fraction lighter than your neighbor's. And I had already been on their radar because I refused to bow down to their ridiculous notices, especially after they tried fining me for leaving my garbage cans out for 10 extra minutes, a fine I didn't pay, which only seemed to make them more determined to break me. I'm not the type to pick fights, but I also won't let someone push me around. And when they realized their letters and warnings weren't making me flinch, they decided to step things up, first by sending threatening emails, then by showing up at HOA meetings and trying to humiliate me in front of others, painting me as a troublemaker. And finally, when none of that worked, they brought out what they must have thought was their trump card, the so-called police. Now here's the thing, I didn't know it right away, but these weren't real cops, they were imposters, hired muscle dressed in bargain bin uniforms with shiny props for badges, and their only purpose was to scare me into obedience. But what the HOA didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood really knew, was that my wife was far from an ordinary suburban woman, because under her calm smile and quiet personality, she carried a badge of her own, a real one, a U.S. Marshal's badge that held the weight of federal authority behind it. And the moment she stepped into the doorway behind me, the entire game would change. But back then, in that first moment, all I felt was the unease, the kind that prickles the back of your neck, because the way they knocked, the way they stood, even the silence between them, it was too polished to be casual but too sloppy to be professional, and my instincts screamed louder with every second that passed. I opened the door just enough to speak through the crack, keeping my hand on the frame like a barrier, and one of them barked out in a voice that tried too hard to sound official, "Sir, we need to talk to you about some complaints regarding your property." And I almost laughed because it was so clearly rehearsed, like a line from a bad play, but I kept my face straight and asked for identification. They flashed their badges quickly, too quickly, as if they didn't want me to get a real look, and that's when my wife appeared behind me in her robe, her hair still tied back from the night, her eyes sharp as ever though, scanning every detail without saying a word. And I knew she had already caught what I did. Those weren't real police badges. But before I get to her part, I want you to understand why the HOA thought they could pull this stunt, because for weeks they had been circling me like vultures, demanding I repaint my mailbox, accusing me of having a fence 1 inch too tall, even sending me a notice about unauthorized shrubs. Can you believe that? Shrubs. As if I had committed some kind of crime against humanity. And when I pushed back with calm but firm responses, they didn't know how to handle it. After all, bullies hate when someone doesn't cower. And the board president, a woman everyone called Karen, even though that wasn't her real name, seemed especially offended by my defiance, like it was personal for her. She thrived on intimidation. She loved seeing neighbors whisper and rush to fix whatever she demanded. And when I didn't play her game, I became her obsession. So the fake police weren't just random. They were her next move in a war she thought she was winning. But as I stood there in my doorway that morning, watching these men shift uncomfortably in their 2 new uniforms, I realized something. They had no idea who they were really dealing with, because they thought I was just another homeowner, someone they could scare into compliance, when in reality, they had walked straight into the home of a federal law enforcement officer's spouse. And that single mistake was about to blow up in their faces in ways they couldn't imagine. The moment those so-called officers stood on my porch, I couldn't help but think back on the weeks leading up to this circus. Because it wasn't like they showed up out of nowhere, no. This was the climax of a slow, grinding campaign the HOA had been waging against me and my wife, and it all started with the simplest of things. The kind of nonsense that makes you question how some people find joy in their lives. Because their first strike against me had been about the paint on my garage door. They claimed it was faded and out of compliance, even though I had painted it only a year before in a shade that matched half the houses on the block. But apparently, because it wasn't an exact match to their color chart, they fined me $50, and when I ignored that fine, figuring they'd eventually realize how ridiculous they were being, they doubled it, then tripled it, sending letter after letter that sounded more threatening each time. I told them flat out I wasn't paying, not for a color that anyone with eyes could see was just fine, and that one refusal seemed to flip a switch in them. Like they had marked me as an enemy, a dissenter who had to be crushed. Because from then on it wasn't just about paint, it was about every single thing they could find. They wrote me up for having my trash can visible from the street on a day it was supposed to be out anyway. Fined me again for unauthorized shrub growth, because a hedge had grown a little taller than their approved height, and even accused me of violating community standards because my porch light bulb was apparently the wrong warmth, something I didn't even know was measurable. Yet there they were acting like I had committed a felony. I tried laughing it off at first, telling my wife that it was only a matter of time before they got bored, but she knew better. She had seen power plays before, and she warned me that this wasn't about rules, this was about control. And once you stood up to people like this, they would keep pressing until they either broke you or you broke them. She was right, of course, because things only escalated. The notices grew nastier, the fines larger, and then came the intimidation tactics that made it personal. One morning I found a letter taped to my door, not mailed but taped, with bold letters saying, "Failure to comply will result in legal action." And I could tell by the shaky handwriting that it wasn't even official, just some board member trying to scare me. And when I confronted the HOA president at the next meeting, she smiled that smug, condescending smile and said, "Well, maybe if you followed the rules you wouldn't have these problems." And that's when I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. They started sending their so-called compliance officers past my house more often, walking slowly, staring at my property like vultures circling a carcass. And I knew it was just to make me feel watched. But instead of fear, it only made me angry, because this was my home, my land, and I wasn't about to be bullied on it. My refusal to bend only seemed to feed their obsession, and soon the fines turned into threats, thinly veiled letters about liens and lawsuits, though none of them had any legal standing, which I knew because my wife quietly explained the law to me, reminding me that HOA power has limits, and that most of their scare tactics fall apart if you know your rights. Still, the pressure kept building, and the board president, Care, as we all called her, made it clear she wasn't going to stop until she saw me kneel. She once showed up at my driveway uninvited, arms crossed, telling me with a smirk that it would be easier if you just complied, like some sort of cartoon villain, and I remember thinking she must actually believe she had authority over my life. That was when the harassment crossed the line, because it wasn't just notices and fines anymore, it was constant surveillance, whispers to other neighbors that I was a problem homeowner. And eventually, when none of that bent me, she decided to bring in the scare tactic to end all scare tactics, the fake police. I later found out through a neighbor who overheard them talking that Karen and a couple of her board buddies thought it would be clever to hire some men they knew who used to work in security to dress up like cops and show up at my door, figuring that the sight of uniforms and badges would finally shut me up. But what they didn't count on was the fact that both my wife and I had sharp eyes for detail. And what they really didn't count on was the fact that those men were about to walk straight into the one house in the neighborhood where intimidation was never going to work. But in the weeks before that morning, I could see the plan forming in their smug expressions, in the way they talked about compliance coming one way or another, and though I didn't know the specifics, I could feel that something big was coming, something desperate, because people like that only escalate when they're losing control, and from the way they kept targeting me, I knew they were already on the edge of making a mistake so big it would destroy them. So that Saturday morning, when the sharp knocks echoed through my house and those two men stood there with their bargain bin, uniforms and their two perfectly polished badges, I could feel the weight of all those weeks of harassment crashing into that moment, like this was the final act in the HOA's desperate play to bring me down. And as I stood in the doorway trying to mask my unease, one of the men straightened his posture, puffed his chest, and barked in a voice that tried to sound authoritative. "Sir, step outside. We need to talk about multiple violations regarding your property." And immediately the words rubbed me the wrong way, because no real officer would phrase it like that. Not without specifics, not without at least identifying themselves first, and the way his partner glanced sideways at him, as if waiting for a cue, only added to my suspicion. But I played it cool, leaning casually against the frame while keeping the door barely cracked, and asked, "And who exactly are you?" That's when they pulled out their badges, flipping them open for maybe a second before snapping them shut again, too fast for me to even see what was written. Though in that brief flash I caught the cheap plastic shine, the kind of thing you'd expect from a Halloween store prop. And it took everything in me not to laugh right then and there, but instead I tilted my head like I was considering it, stalling for time because I could sense my wife's presence just behind me, standing silently but alert, her eyes narrowing as she studied every detail of their uniforms, from the mismatched patches on their sleeves to the black boots that looked brand new and unscuffed, completely unlike the gear of officers who actually worked in the field. The taller one, clearly trying to act like he was in charge, adjusted his sunglasses and said, "We've received multiple complaints from your homeowners association about non-compliance, and as law enforcement we take these matters very seriously. So if you don't want this to escalate, you need to cooperate with us now." And that was the moment the last shred of doubt evaporated, because no real cop in their right mind would openly declare they were acting on behalf of an HOA. That alone was a dead giveaway. But I kept my face neutral and asked them what department they were from, and the shorter one fumbled, stammering something about local enforcement division, which wasn't even a thing, at least not in our county. And when I asked again, he quickly changed it to municipal police, his eyes darting nervously, as though he hoped I wouldn't press him further. My wife shifted her weight slightly, stepping closer so that she stood right behind me now, and I could feel her energy radiating, calm yet deadly serious, the kind of quiet intensity that told me she was already in full professional mode, even if she hadn't revealed who she really was yet. The fake cops, too focused on me, hadn't even registered her presence as a threat, which was their second mistake, because she was watching everything, every slip of the tongue, every mismatched thread in their cheap uniforms, and I could tell she was cataloguing it all in her head for when the moment came to strike. The taller one leaned in, lowering his voice as if to sound intimidating, and said, "Listen, you can make this easy or you can make this hard, but either way, you're coming with us." And I almost laughed again, because the idea of two supposed officers threatening to drag me out of my own house over shrubs and a mailbox was so absurd it bordered on comedy. But instead I raised an eyebrow and said calmly, "If that's the case, I'll need to see your badges again, this time properly." And when I said that I noticed the flicker of panic in their eyes, the way the taller one quickly tried to redirect, saying, "Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." "Sir?" as if ignoring my request would make me forget it. But of course it only confirmed what I already knew. They were fakes. My wife finally spoke then, her voice steady, quiet, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through their charade. "Which precinct are you from?" she asked, and the two men glanced at each other before the shorter one blurted out a number that didn't even exist in our city, some random digits that might have sounded official to an average homeowner. But to us it was as phony as the rest of their act, and I watched her lips curve just slightly in a knowing smile, the kind that made me realize she was already planning her next move. The fake cops, still oblivious, decided to press harder, one of them stepping forward like he was about to wedge his boot into the door, saying, "Sir, refusal to cooperate will result in arrest." And that's when my wife's hand gently touched my arm, a subtle signal to hold steady, to let them dig their own hole a little deeper before she revealed the truth. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, not from fear but from anticipation, because every second they kept talking, they gave themselves away more and more. And the funniest part was, they didn't even realize it. Their belts were missing standard equipment, no radios, no handcuffs, just cheap flashlights clipped awkwardly, as if to complete the costume. And their hats bore no insignia, just blank black caps pulled low over their sunglasses. And I knew that anyone with a fraction of sense could tell these weren't cops. But Karen and her crew must have thought I was too gullible to notice. The taller one tried one more time, his voice rising. "This is your last chance. Come with us now or face the consequences." And that was the breaking point. The moment my wife decided enough was enough, because she stepped forward into the doorway, placing herself shoulder to shoulder with me, her posture relaxed but commanding. And though she still hadn't reached for her badge, I could feel the shift in the air, the way authority radiated from her naturally. The kind of presence that only comes from years of real training and real power. And for the first time I noticed the fake cops hesitate, as if they could sense something wasn't right, but couldn't quite put their finger on it yet. I let the silence hang there, letting them stew in their own incompetence, before I said casually, "You know, something is really off about those badges," repeating the thought I'd had earlier, and watching their faces tighten, told me they knew the game was slipping out of their control. Because the truth was, their whole act was crumbling, and my wife was about to deliver the final blow that would expose them completely. The air between us was so heavy, you could almost hear it crack, the two fake cops shifting nervously on my porch, while my wife stepped just a little closer into the frame of the doorway. The morning light catching her eyes in that way that made them look sharper, colder, the kind of look that always told me she was in full professional mode. And I knew exactly what was about to happen, though the imposters had no clue they were seconds away from their whole plan collapsing, and she let them stew for a moment, let their bluff hang in the air until it nearly suffocated them. Then in a voice that was calm, steady, and carried more authority than either of them could ever fake, she asked again, "Which precinct did you say you're from?" And when they hesitated, fumbling for an answer, she slowly reached into her robe pocket and pulled out a black leather case, smooth and worn in a way no prop could ever be, flipping it open with a snap that cut through the silence. And there, gleaming in the dull morning light, was her U.S. Marshal badge, polished and real, the kind of emblem that carries the full weight of federal law. And the second it caught their eyes, I saw it, the panic, the way their smug act shattered instantly, replaced by wide-eyed fear as their brains scrambled to process what they were looking at. "You boys picked the wrong house," she said evenly, her voice low but deadly certain. And in that instant, the entire power dynamic flipped on its head, because the two men who had walked up to my porch thinking they held all the cards were suddenly standing frozen, caught red-handed in a crime that could land them behind real bars. And the silence that followed was so thick, I swear you could have heard a pin drop. The taller one stammered first, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding. We were just..." But he couldn't finish the sentence, because my wife snapped the badge shut and squared her shoulders, her tone now sharp as steel. "Impersonating a police officer is a federal crime, and right now you're standing on my property, committing it in front of a U.S. Marshal. So unless you want to spend the rest of your day in handcuffs, you'd better explain exactly who sent you here." The color drained from their faces, their fake confidence melting away like snow under the sun. And the shorter one instinctively took a step back, glancing down the street as if considering running. But my wife's eyes locked on him like a hawk, and he froze again, trapped under that unblinking gaze of someone who had seen far worse than two amateurs in thrift store uniforms. I couldn't help but marvel at the transformation, because a moment ago these men had tried to tower over me, barking threats and pretending authority, but now it was my wife towering over them, without raising her voice or moving an inch, the sheer weight of her badge and her presence making them shrink like children caught stealing cookies. The taller one swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like he lumped in his throat, and muttered, "We didn't mean any harm. This was just..." Just a misunderstanding with the HOA. They asked us to—" And before he could dig himself any deeper, my wife cut him off, her voice cold and precise. "So the HOA hired you to impersonate law enforcement and intimidate a resident? Do you understand how many laws you've broken already?" And I swear I saw his knees wobble, because the reality of what he had admitted slipped out of his mouth faster than he could stop it. And now it was too late. The shorter one tried to smooth things over, his voice trembling. "Look, we're not real cops, okay? We're just trying to help keep order around here, that's all. We were just doing what we were told." But the excuse sounded pathetic even to his own ears, and the way my wife tilted her head at him, unimpressed and utterly unmoved, made it clear that no amount of backpedaling was going to save them from the hole they had dug. I stayed quiet, letting her command the scene, because it was obvious that she was the storm they never saw coming. And watching the way they squirmed under her gaze was more satisfying than anything I could have said myself. The taller one raised his hands slightly, almost like he was surrendering, and stammered, We don't want trouble, ma'am, we'll just leave. No need to make this bigger than it is." But my wife didn't blink, didn't budge. She simply said, "Too late for that. You've already made it big the second you put those costumes on." And then she leaned forward just enough that her words hit them like a hammer. "Turn around, hands where I can see them." The panic was plain now. Their fake bravado shattered beyond repair, and for a second they froze, looking at each other like deer in headlights, silently begging the other to make the first move. But they couldn't, because they knew the game was over. I could feel the tension in the air, the shift so palpable it was almost electric, and I thought to myself that this was the exact moment Karen and her little HOA cronies had never accounted for, because they thought they were sending these two clowns to intimidate some helpless homeowner. But instead they had sent them straight into a trap, straight into the home of someone who not only knew her rights but carried the law in her pocket. The taller one finally broke, his voice desperate. "Please, just let us go, we won't come back. We'll tell them it didn't work." But my wife's expression didn't soften, and I knew that mercy wasn't hers to give right now. Not when a line this serious had been crossed, and though she hadn't called it in yet, the weight of what was about to happen hung over all of us. The power shift was complete. What started as their show of dominance had crumbled into a scene where they were nothing but scared amateurs standing helpless in front of a federal officer. And the longer the silence dragged on, the clearer it became to them that their fate wasn't in their hands anymore, it was in hers, and there was no way to backpedal far enough to escape it. The silence broke when my wife finally reached for her phone, dialing with a steady hand as the two men shifted uncomfortably, their bravado long gone, and within minutes, the sound of real sirens echoed down our street, flashing lights bouncing off every window as actual police cruisers pulled up. The difference between the imposters and the professionals so stark it was almost comical, and neighbors peeked through curtains and stepped out onto porches to watch the drama unfold, whispers spreading like wildfire as uniformed officers quickly took control of the scene, ordering the fake cops to the ground, confiscating their phony badges and weapons, and cuffing them right there in front of the whole neighborhood. My wife didn't raise her voice, didn't boast. She just handed over her credentials to the responding sergeant, calmly explaining the situation, her tone professional and measured, while I stood beside her, still processing how fast the tide had turned. The imposters were practically begging now, stammering excuses about just doing a job and not meaning any harm. But the officers weren't having it, because impersonating law enforcement isn't some petty prank, it's a felony. And the looks on their faces when they realized they were headed to the county jail were a mix of shame, regret, and raw fear. The real twist, though, came when the truth about who hired them slipped out under questioning, because once cornered, the taller one broke down and admitted it was the HOA president and a couple of board members who had orchestrated the entire stunt, paying them under the table to show up at my door and teach me a lesson. And when those words left his mouth, I saw the sergeant's expression darken, because suddenly this wasn't just about a pair of imposters. This was about a community board abusing power and crossing into criminal territory. Word spread faster than fire, neighbors murmuring in shock as the officers confirmed what everyone had suspected, but never dared say out loud: that the HOA had gone too far, that Karen and her cronies had crossed a line so bold it couldn't be ignored. Within hours, investigators were speaking with residents, collecting statements and building a case. And my wife provided a clear, professional account that made it impossible for anyone to spin the story differently. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The HOA board was suspended pending investigation, their emails and meeting minutes subpoenaed, and the president herself was served with a legal notice that very week, her smug confidence evaporating when real consequences landed on her doorstep. The fake cops were formally charged with impersonating law enforcement and conspiracy, both serious enough to guarantee prison time, and their mugshots ran in the local paper under a headline that made the whole neighborhood buzz: "Men posing as police hired by HOA board." It was surreal to see it in black and white, surreal but satisfying, because for weeks I had been painted as the troublemaker, the problem neighbor, and now the truth stood plain for everyone to see. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the target of an HOA that had let power rot their judgment, and thanks to my wife's calm authority, their scheme had blown up in their faces. Fines followed, heavy ones, tens of thousands levied against the HOA for legal violations and restitution, draining their coffers and leaving them scrambling to explain to homeowners why dues had to spike to cover their mess. And the board members who weren't directly involved resigned in shame, too embarrassed to face the community. For the first time in months, I could walk through the neighborhood without glares or whispers, because now people nodded. Some even apologized for believing the lies, and more than one neighbor thanked my wife personally for standing up, not just for us, but for everyone who had felt the HOA's heavy hand. Watching Karen pack up her things after being ousted from the board was a sight I'll never forget. Her shoulders slumped, her confidence gone. No longer the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, but just another homeowner, stripped of her crown. And though part of me wanted to gloat, I didn't have to. The justice system had already done that for me. In the weeks that followed, our neighborhood slowly returned to the quiet, peaceful rhythm it once had, the kind of rhythm that made me move there in the first place. And as the legal dust settled, the shadow that the HOA had cast over our lives seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of relief among the residents who had also suffered under their bullying tactics, but never felt brave enough to push back until now. And I could feel it every time someone waved from their yard or stopped me on the sidewalk to say they finally felt like they could breathe again without the constant fear of a letter, a fine, or a knock at the door. My wife, calm as always, never once tried to make herself the center of the story, even though she was the reason it ended the way it did. And I found myself more grateful every day that she had been there when those fake officers tried to scare us. Because where I had felt confusion and unease, she had felt nothing but resolve, standing like a wall between me and the chaos. And it was her quiet authority that exposed the entire scheme. The HOA was humbled in a way no angry letter or heated argument could have managed. Stripped of their power, their reputation in tatters, their arrogance replaced with silence, and even those who had once supported them now avoided eye contact, ashamed of how far things had gone. Walking through the neighborhood, I noticed a change, not just in how people treated us, but in how they treated each other, with less suspicion, less division, as if the exposure of the HOA's corruption had pulled everyone together, reminding us that communities are supposed to protect one another, not prey on each other. At home, sitting on the porch with my wife as the sun set, I reflected on everything we had endured, the harassment, the threats, the fake police, and realized that sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought with fists or weapons, but with courage, persistence, and the refusal to be intimidated, and that the law, when upheld by the right people, is the strongest shield of all. My wife never needed to raise her voice, never needed to show anger, because true authority doesn't scream, it speaks softly and carries weight. And that night when she revealed her badge will forever live in my memory as the moment the entire story turned upside down. Looking back now, I see it as more than just a personal victory. It was a lesson about standing up when it's hardest, about trusting in the truth even when lies seem louder, and about remembering that intimidation only works if you let it. For all their scheming, for all their planning, the HOA had forgotten one simple truth: fear collapses in the face of real courage. And so when I think about the night it all came to a head, about the fake cops stammering as real sirens approached, about Karen's face when she realized her empire was crumbling, I can't help but smile at the irony, because they thought they had us cornered. but they never expected her.